Welcome to the training course for the MOX Metrology Process Studio, or as we commonly call it, MPS. I'm Kurt Casto. I'm the lead developer for MOX MPS. I'm going to take you on a tour of MPS. This is really just going to be a quick overview of the layout of MPS, just to get you familiar with which tools are where. And then we'll go into individual training sessions on using the different tools and creating data sheets, executing calibrations, and all of that. Okay, first thing to know about MPS is that it has two master modes, calibration and design. The calibration master mode is when you first start up MPS, it comes up in calibration mode. The expectation being that most of the time when you use the software, you're about to do a calibration. If you want to actually build data sheets, which the data sheets are the templates for the calibrations, they contain all the test points with the specifications for the test points and the tolerances, and they have all of the standards that we're going to use configured in the uncertainty models. The calibrations are actually the executions of the template. So for each instrument we calibrate, we'll have a calibration document that's based on the datasheet template. Okay, so we're going to start with calibration mode, and I have a calibration already open just to save a little time here for this quick demo. I just want to show you some of the tools. So there we have calibration mode. In this case, we're just using one channel. MPS is multi-channels. So if you were doing something like thermocouples, where you might have 3 thermocouples in the bath at the same time, you could open 3 channels and do all 3 of them at once. The only requirement is that they have to have the same datasheet. To view calibration channels, this button up here under display areas, if I click on this, this will show me my calibration channels. But if you notice this little area that's up here, this is one of the channels. If I had 3 channels open, there would be 3 of these. And I can manually click on one of them to make it the active channel, or just by navigation while we're doing the calibration, it can do that automatically too. We'll talk about that later. I'm going to turn that area back off. But if you notice this display before I do, and then look over here, you can see it's pretty much the same information, but this is for the currently selected channel. So if we're only using one channel, we don't really need to display the channels. It would be redundant. This button up here turns off our primary workspace. If you look on the right side over here before I do that, you can see an area, and we've got some different tool buttons up here to activate the tools. And if I turn that off, then it lets me see more of my main data sheet for when I'm doing calibrations. So after you set up the calibration, you can toggle off the workspace so that you can see more of what's going on. Okay, so let's talk about the tools while we're here. The tools for calibration mode are calibration standards and measurements. So the first thing we would do if we were going to do a calibration, this calibration has one standard, a meter calibrator, and we have 4 different choices of flute calibrators that we could use. Right now we have a 5700 selected. We would give it an asset ID, and if MPS is configured to use our calibration management system, MOX CMS, then it would automatically look it up and give you the due date and all of that. Okay, so this is for measurements that we would be about to make. So if we were going to make new measurements, we would need to set this up. Now, this tab over here shows me standards used for measurements already made. If I look at my standards list, these are the standards that were used for as found, just one, and for as left. MPS does support using multiple standards, so you might have a meter calibrator for some tests and be using a signal generator or something for other tests. That's all fine. Under test point usage, this just shows me details about the as found and as left measurements. So it's showing me the standard that was used, all kinds of information about it, the uncertainty model that was in effect, and the risk for the measurement, the probability of false accept, probability of false reject. If I click on different test points, You can see that information updates for the currently selected test point. This is really a key thing to remember about MPS, is that everything in the system is really slave to which test point you're on. So the currently active test point in this grid pretty much drives everything else in the user interface around it. And another important thing to remember is that you can navigate through this grid by holding down the Alt key and using the arrows. So up and down arrows will take me up and down my test points, and then Alt right arrows will take me right and left through the grid. Okay, and that will be important to use throughout the system. Okay, so on with our tools. This basically shows automation scripting, which we'll get into later. But these are actual script commands. We're not really going to talk about that. Automation scripting is done in calibration mode. The reason for that is you need to have access to the calibration channels and be able to step through it. So seemingly you would think design mode would be the logical place for it, but it's really not. Calibration mode is the logical place for it in this case. All right, so under analysis, we've got some tools. The first tool over here is just showing me detail. This is the datasheet document inspector. This is going to show me all kinds of detailed information about the test point. Usually in the user interface, you see things like the EMU here is rounded. Well, this will show you the full floating point values. And then this tab will show you information from the datasheet header, which we'll talk about later. All right, the analysis mode. The analysis mode actually will let you load calibration history, and you can select different things to filter on. For instance, if I want to use all instruments, and as I click on different test points, you can see that showing me all the measurement history of all calibrations that were performed using the test point of the datasheet that currently has focus. We can filter that for different asset IDs or technicians who did the work. We can do interval analysis. We can have it do an interval analysis report on that. So let me just do this real quick just to show you what that looks like. Okay, so up comes a report, and we won't get into any detail on this now because we'll be talking about this in more detail later. But this is showing me for all my test points, my measurement history and all of that, and interval analysis and reliability and all of that kind of thing. All right. And then, of course, our last tool in calibration mode is the calibration standard setup. Now, this requires a configuration option to enable in calibration mode. A lot of labs don't want technicians changing the standards configurations during the calibration. Some labs might. That's really up to you. We'll be talking about this form in great detail later, so I really won't say anything else about it right now. Okay, that's primarily all you need to know for now about calibration. As I said, all of the other functionality of performing calibrations and loading data sheets to do cals and all that we'll talk about later. So the next thing I want to do is I'm just going to release my calibration channel. And now we're going to switch to the design master mode. The design master mode is where we would actually build the calibrations. Okay, in order to actually do any designing, we would want to be in template editing, which is over here. Once I enable edit mode, you'll notice that there's no tools or anything here. But once I enable edit mode, all my editing tools show up. So a common theme in MPS about editing tools is I'm going to show you some examples down here. All right, these will appear every time you have a grid. You'll usually see a toolbar above it, and they've got pretty much the same tools. I mean, some things have additional tools, but generally, anytime you see the plus, that's going to be to add an item. So if I click plus here, it would be to add an instrument for this calibration standard. If I click up here and under test point and I hit add, you can guess what's going to happen. It's going to append a new test point to the end. This is the insert button, which is just like add, except it inserts at the current location. Delete. This will delete the currently selected item, or if supported, items. And this is another thing I want to talk about in MPS. A lot of features that are in here, you can multiple select. So for instance, if I first click on a test point over here, and if I hold down the shift key and click on this test point, it will select that range. So for instance, if I tell it to delete these test points, okay, that will delete the selected range. If I only have one selected, then obviously it will just delete the one. All right, back over here to our buttons. You'll often have a delete all button, which will delete all items on this list. The pencil is the edit button, which will allow you to edit, bring up an editor relative to the currently selected item. Anytime you see an eyeball button like this, that means that there's a view available for the currently selected item. So if I click on the eyeball, it brings up this form where I can view specification information about that standard. Okay, and then you have the up and down arrows. These will move items up and down on the list. So, okay, that just changes their order on the list. So those are really the most common editing tools that you'll find throughout MPS. And anytime you see these buttons, they have pretty much the same function wherever they are. And usually, as I said, when you see a grid of some kind, look above it for these buttons. Okay, just talking again real quick about tools that are in here. The same thing applies what I told you before about tool editing, turning on the tool editor. Up here, if I turn off the workspace, then I can see more of my grid. If I turn the workspace back on, then I see my tools. These tools all have this button on them. And what this button does, if I click on it, it will detach it from the tool and let me move it somewhere else. So I'm just going to do this for the moment. I only have one screen here for the demo. But if I click on another tool, and I have it show that one too. Let me just make this a little smaller. What this is typically really about is if you have multiple monitors, it makes it really nice because you can have these tools, you can drag them over to your second monitor. And then if you remember what I told you about using the Alt and the arrow keys for the grid, if I move down test points, you can see that both of those forms are updating as I move through the test points. Well, there's really nothing to see on the left one, so let me switch to a tab that changes with the test points. Okay, so now you can see as I'm moving up and down the test points, both of those forms are changing or updating because they're, again, tied to the currently active test point. As I told you, that's really a key concept in MPS, is that most of the user interface is driven around which test point is currently selected. Okay, I can send these tools back to their home location. Oh, before I do that, one other thing I'll tell you is that once you've detached the forms and put them on a second monitor, now you can turn off your workspace if you want, so that you can see more of the grid at one time. Okay, I mean, that's a nice feature if you have multiple monitors because it really is handy to be able to see like the standards and the uncertainty model at the same time. Otherwise, you have to choose the button. Okay, to send these tools home back to their native location, you can do one of two things. You can again click on the button up here on the tool, which will send it back to its regular location. Or if you click on its place by clicking on its tool button and you do this button, it will call it home. Okay. So let's talk quickly about the tools that are here. We have the datasheet document header, and that just contains header information for the datasheet: model, manufacturer, description, specification interval, specification reference, procedure information. Again, just general information. We're going to talk about this in detail, so I won't now. The test point builder you can use to actually build test points. Just again, as I move up and down, you can see that is being updated with the test point that I'm on showing the actual low-level specifications. This tool we actually use to create test points from the instrument specifications. The uncertainty editor. The uncertainty editor is where we edit the uncertainty model for the test point. A lot of what MPS does with the uncertainty model, it can do automatically. So for instance, these budget items that you see, they're kind of grayish. The reason that they're grayish is because they're added automatically. Ones that you add manually would be a darker color, a darker black. Okay, there's also an advanced model editor tool, which we'll talk about later. Calibration standards. This is where you configure calibration standards for the datasheet. Here's the instrument. We're using a meter calibrator. We're setting up these MET-spec instruments. We'll talk about all this in detail. These are the actual standard ranges from each instrument that's assigned to the test point. Again, don't worry about the specifics of it at this point. And then the My MET-spec file. This is the Fluke 77 spec sheet, which we'll talk about later. And these last two are the same as you saw in calibration mode, the document inspector and the calibration interval analysis. So if I load that history, there's the calibration history again. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about before I end the introduction session is just how to actually open a datasheet, do new datasheet. So for if I want to do a new datasheet, I come up here to File, Datasheet Template, New Template. And that creates a new blank datasheet. If I want to work on an existing datasheet, I can go to File, Datasheet, Open Template from Database, and then here's the catalog of the datasheets. And you can search by model, manufacturer, description, and several other things. So say if I wanted a data sheet for a 34401, okay, I can click and there's two of them. So I can select that and look and see which one I want. There's detail on the right-hand side, so I can tell which one of those I want. And then I can either double click on it over here or click OK, and it will load that data sheet. And if I click on editing, I can start to edit. Okay, that's going to be it for the quick introduction. So we'll talk about specific topics in the next session.